Good evening, everyone. My name is David Holsker. I am a vice chair of Brooklyn for Peace, the organization that is sponsoring this. As you can see from the sign, we are a mere 30 years young this year. That's a good thing that we're around. It's a bad thing that we still need to be around. Unfortunately, we still do. There is an urgent need for a peace organization that is active and is present in Brooklyn, educating and engaged with people in Brooklyn. Thank Brooklyn Friends for their kindness in hosting this event. Many of you have devices such as the one I'm about to hold up. Let us all join together and put it on silent or stun or off or whatever works for you. Get out of the way relatively quickly. We will present our award to Michael, about whom I will tell you shortly. We will then pause for a moment that refreshes. We will take questions from the audience. I'll be happy to take your questions and have Michael answer them, and then we will adjourn downstairs for a reception till about 9:30. Hope that's acceptable to all, and thank you again for coming. Michael Ratner is the President Emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, and wisely became the chair of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin. He's part of a small group of lawyers that has been representing detainees at Guantanamo since there first was a detainee at Guantanamo beginning in 2002. He has led CCR in establishing a network of lawyers, 600 pro bono lawyers, to represent the Guantanamo detainees, who, notwithstanding the pledge of the president to close the facility, remain incarcerated. And a true shame for the United States and our increasingly appalling human rights record. He is continuing this work with the hope of finally shutting down Guantanamo and ending the policies that underlie it. But of course, the policies that underlie it are what used to be called in the Bush administration the Global War on Terror, or GWAT. Unfortunately, the name has been changed, but the substance of an endless war continues under the Obama administration and is clearly the de facto policy of both major parties in this country. Hence the continuing need for an organization like Brooklyn for Peace to turn that policy around, and hence the continuing need to address the civil liberties infringements that necessarily occur whenever a country goes to war, and that have occurred with disturbing frequency and regularity since the United States embarked on this ill-conceived and largely illegal war on terror. Michael is actively litigating against drone killings, something that we can expect to start seeing in New York City in the not-too-distant future. He represents the family of Anwar al-Awlaki in a damage case against government officials. Mr. al-Awlaki was a citizen of the United States who was killed at the order of the President of the United States without benefit of a criminal indictment, jury, or jury trial. He and CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, are currently the U.S. counsel for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. I need not describe them to you. He's also engaged in efforts in European courts to bring U.S. officials to account for torture as well as their actions at Guantanamo. Michael has been a leader in litigating in this area of international law since I first encountered him in law school 3 decades ago, and continues to do that. So Brooklyn for Peace is honored to present him with this award. Charlotte will do that.
You have to stand up? Okay.
He has to stand up. say just a few more words about Michael before I turn this over to him. Michael has been instrumental in litigating against government spying in its myriad forms. Hello, NSA, hope you're having a good time. As you listen to this and watch us, he has been particularly active in responding to the government's targeting of Muslim activists, something that Brooklyn for Peace began doing immediately following 9/11 and the assaults and roundup of anybody who might have been Muslim or Sikh or South Asian or whatever was the determining factor for why people got rounded up. I would say in conclusion that Michael and CCR have been very active on the issues of Palestinian rights. They've represented the Gaza flotilla, which attempted to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza. He's represented the family of Rachel Corrie. He's worked to protect those who advocate on behalf of Palestinians in this country, something that unfortunately, given the pro-Israeli clampdown that we see continuing at the University of Illinois and other places, is absolutely necessary. He is a co-founder of the Palestinian Solidarity Legal Support Organization, which defends the rights of Palestinians across the U.S. Again, this is an area in which Brooklyn for Peace was and continues to be very active. Michael is a worthy recipient. We are honored to have him. I give you Michael Ratner.
Thank you, David. David did work on cases with us, actually, when we were at the center. He worked on, now he reminded me, a case called Velardeca v. Pena, which was the first case in the United States where we could hold a torturer who had tortured someone in Paraguay guilty of torture when he came into the United States. It began a long line of cases of holding dictators overseas who would visit the United States for human rights violations. A very, very important line of cases. David was one of the lawyers, Peter Weiss, Rhonda Copeland, and a couple of others. A historic CCR case in 1981. You know, when I thought about what I was going to say, I was given some advice. Oh, Michael, make it a somewhat legal talk. You know, you're a lawyer. And I said, well, law isn't doing so well these days. So I'll try. We'll get to that. But it's not like we're doing really well on core issues of drones, wars, Guantanamo. We'll get there. Before that, I went and looked at the Brooklyn Peace website, and I was pleased to see two things immediately which are dear to my heart. One, David mentioned, which is the position on ending the Gaza war and ending the occupation. And when I walked in here, someone said, Michael, you should say something more about that because it's not always the easiest issue for people. Just as it wasn't the easiest issue for me, who was raised in a very, very Zionist household. I went to Israel when I was a child. I had actually, this is unusual, probably no one in the room had this. I had a hand-painted map of Israel on my ceiling. And I was a Zionist. I had a hand-painted map. I had a hand-painted map of, is it what word? It's not on, that's the problem.
Not a mic.
Okay, I'll speak louder then. I had a hand-painted map of Israel on my ceiling, and it took a long evolution in my own life to get to the position where I was both politically as well as emotionally someone who would support Palestinian rights and ending the occupation. I won't give you all that history. That's not what I'm here for. I can only tell you that one of the key events took place very late in my life. One of the key events was when my children, who are now in their mid-20s, said, well, we're interested in going to Gaza. And so I said, we'll go to Gaza on a Code Pink trip. And of course, we never got into Gaza. And so we flew to Tel Aviv, took a car into the West Bank. And I took my kids and all of us to Hebron. And once they went through Hebron, they had no issue any longer about how they were going to talk about Palestine and Israel and rights and checkpoints, etc. I can only say that emotionally it was a longer distance for me than politically. Politically, I understood it pretty quickly, coming out of the tradition and background I have since the 1960s. Emotionally, it took longer. So that was one thing that on your website, the Brooklyn Peace website, that I liked. The second thing I saw that a position that, again, has not been the easiest, as everybody says, well, what are we going to do with ISIS? We have to bomb, we have to bomb, we have to bomb. And Brooklyn Peace takes a position that it has to be settled through diplomacy and not bombing. Again, a position that I again don't do it out of just naivety. I do it out of some knowledge, and I don't know if many of you have either watched the interviews with Patrick Coburn on Democracy Now! Or read his book, The Rise of the Jihadists, which talks about what happened that brought ISIS to the fore. Of course, we all know, number one, the Iraq War was what devastated that area. We can talk a little bit more about that or get questions. But what Patrick also says is after 9/11, the U.S. went after the wrong people. It should have gone after Saudi Arabia, which was funding all of this.
That's right.
Funding all of this, and Pakistan and its security services as well. Gave them a pass, and now, for a combination of factors, we're where we are. Patrick Coburn strongly suggests there has to be some kind of, not a peace treaty, but a truce between Assad, who of course the U.S. had at the overthrow for a long time, but Assad and whatever moderate forces we can find in Syria as the only way in which we're actually going to get out of there without a 10 or 20-year war. So again, as I look at your website, I was pleased to see those two positions. Another thing that I noticed was that the organization was founded in 1984, right after the invasion of Grenada by the United States. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Grenada, how many of you knew the revolution. I knew that revolution. I was friendly would be too strong a word, but certainly acquainted with Maurice Bishop. And I brought a case right during that invasion. It was called Conyers v. Reagan, and it was against the illegality of that invasion because it did not have congressional consent. And Congressman Conyers was one of my plaintiffs. He'd say, you bypassed the Congress, you didn't give us the authority to vote on this war. And like the other cases which I'll mention, we lost that case. We lost it at least on the grounds that the war only took 4 days and it was over, so that it was, quote, moot. But it was a serious case, but it again showed me that trying to litigate in any way to hold this government accountable for restrictions, particularly on war, whether it's the congressional requirement that you have Congress approve a war, or the UN requirement that you can't go to war except in self-defense, or under Section 7 of the UN Charter. Those, when the U.S. wants to make war because it perceives that war is the way it keeps its hegemony or interest, it makes war. All the laws in the world are not going to stop it. I go back, as I think, of course, of King's speech in '67, which is still my favorite single speech, the Riverside speech, when he went beyond Vietnam, when he went beyond Vietnam and started talking about Vietnam and not just civil rights at home. And he said three things which you all know, and I like to evaluate sometimes where we are on those three things: the triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. So it's only been 33 plus 14, 47 years since that speech. And if we look at racism, and we just put in Ferguson and the new Jim Crow, we don't have a lot of good to say in advancement on that issue. If we look at extreme materialism, just think about Occupy Wall Street and the 1%. And if we look at militarism, we probably are fighting more wars than I remember in my history of fighting wars for the last 40 years. So that's the situation we're living in. As I don't have to tell you all, we have plenty of work to do. They insisted my talk have a title, and they went back and said, title this, title that, let's appeal to people. So we titled it From Guantanamo to WikiLeaks, Taking on the State in a Post-9/11 World. Now, one thing I should say, we have not been very successful in taking on the state in the post-9/11 world. But let's talk a little bit about that title. One is Guantanamo. Guantanamo was really CCR's and my earliest case post-9/11. Before that, just before that, we had roundups of Muslims in the city, checkerboarded around the different prisons. We had a couple of Arabic speakers in the office so we could represent them. but we could never actually find where they were. We ultimately brought a case called Turkman, in which we are still arguing about parts of it, but which we prevailed, in which Muslims were just picked up arbitrarily between there were certain ages in certain countries, but without any guilt of anything at all. I'm actually talking loudly, but I'll try harder.
Maybe people could move on here also.
I should move. No, they should.
No, folks in the back, if you can't having a little trouble hearing, just move forward.
I'll try louder even than I'm speaking. In any case, the Guantanamo cases were the first real set of cases. And at the time we took them, we didn't know people would go to Guantanamo, but we knew that the president had issued an order saying he could pick up any person anywhere in the world and take them to an offshore prison, and they would have no trial and no right to test their detention. You probably all know that story. At that time, it was late 2001. The first people went to Guantanamo in January 2002. The center started by representing some of the first people at Guantanamo. We could get no other human rights organization in the country to do it. They were afraid of losing their funding. They were afraid the anger in the country was too great, and no one else would join us. A couple of other lawyers, death penalty lawyers, did join us on that. I guess death penalty lawyers are used to that kind of anger in a community. So we began with Guantanamo, and despite the efforts of all of the lawyers we eventually put together, some 600 lawyers, as David said, we haven't yet closed Guantanamo. And in my view, I'm talking about Guantanamo in the title because it's emblematic, really. It's emblematic of the barbarism that this country has sunk into. What I call at Guantanamo forever detention, drones, which are assassinations, torture, which we did on a rampant scale, war, which we're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we'll count them, war crimes, massive surveillance. We're in a very, I don't want to be Pollyannish here, we're in a very dark time. That's that part of the title. The other part is WikiLeaks, and that gives me more hope, not necessarily at a grassroots level, which is where I think change comes from, but in the sense that it's really opened up this government. And when I speak about WikiLeaks, I'm not just talking about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. I'm talking about Chelsea Manning, who gave out hundreds of thousands of pages of the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, the collateral murder video, the 150,000 pages of Cablegate. I'm talking about Chelsea Manning. I'm talking about Jeremy Hammond, who hacked into a private security company. And I'm talking about Edward Snowden, who was in Moscow. Those are people who, in the face of this, what I would call barbarism, actually made choices that could literally, in some cases did, put them into jail, and still may put them into jails for a long time. So those are the kind of people and the heroes that we need to take on the state. The Chelsea Mannings, the Ed Snowdens, and the like. And when I thought about it, I had a discussion recently, I was just saying to David, I recently met with a group which probably most of you don't know. It's called the MST. It's the Movement for the Landless Peasants in Brazil. And it's huge. It's 2.5 million landless peasants who over the years have fought to get their land back and have an incredibly organized system. They have activist schools. They're probably one of the major progressive social forces in the world right now. Very active in Brazil. And I spent a lot of time talking to them. How do you work? How do your schools work? How do the wage differentials work? There's there's 400 lawyers in the group, et cetera. How does all of this work? After we had that long discussion, they started asking me all about WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Ed Snowden, and the rest. And they spent an hour with me knowing where are they, what are they doing, why are they doing this? And it seemed peculiar and odd to me. I said, they're organizing this huge landless peasants movement, and why do they care about these cases that have exposed both wide government surveillance as well as criminality by the U.S. government? And I've always been, and a lot of people have supported WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning, the whole exposure on the basis of we shouldn't be surveilled, we should have privacy, government criminality should be exposed, and this is all a good thing. And what MST said to me, one of the leaders of MST said to me, without missing a beat, he said, the reason we support Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Ed Snowden, WikiLeaks, is because what they did is a blow against imperialism. So to hear that from the global South, saying what is going on for them is that this is a way of beginning to tear apart the fabric of hegemony of the United States. And if I have to admit to myself why I have taken so much effort and the Center so much effort around defending WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and the others, is because we don't see it as just a question of beating back surveillance. Of course you have to do that. Or of just exposing criminality. But we see it as some way of beginning to throw some kind of a wrench into this hegemonic system that, in my view, is still what King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. So that explains probably better than anything my own involvement. Now, we can talk a little bit about the third part of the sentence, or the talk. It says, taking on the state in a post-9/11 world. As I said, at first I didn't want to make that talk because it's not exactly a talk of my great, or the Center's great successes. You know, in the past we won. Before 9/11, we always had trouble, obviously, winning on national security issues. We won on issues with great hard fights, as you know, even post 9/11, on issues of race, particularly in this city, the stop and frisk, as well as the fire department discrimination case. Those took 14 years. They didn't finally get settled until we had a new mayor. The other mayor fought us tooth and nail on what should be bread and butter non-discrimination cases, complete bread and butter. But on the other bigger cases, taking on national security, we have not had a lot of success. What we looked at 9/11, tried to use law as a means of enforcing restraints on force. That's what I mentioned to you with wars, both the Constitution and the UN Charter, as a means of guaranteeing the integrity of human beings so they couldn't get tortured, they couldn't get indefinitely detained, and as a means of holding the government officials who did those things accountable. And I have to say, in those respects, the law has been a colossal failure. And not just a failure, but post 9/11 has really eviscerated the lip service that have been paid to legal restraints in this country for many years. The limits on the use of force to settle disputes, in other words, war, rendition, torture, and on, they really don't exist anymore. In a way, it's not a nice story to tell, but I try and think, what can I learn out of this story? What can we all learn? First lesson, and I'll give a couple examples as I go on. First lesson is how relatively easily the United States can cast aside legal constraints when power in this country thinks that war and casting aside those constraints is necessary to continue in power. The bombing of Syria is the latest example. No UN authority, no congressional authority. Second, something we all learn in high school. Sounds great, checks and balances. Oh my, we're going to have Congress check the executive, we'll have the executive check Congress, we'll have the court check them both, and we'll keep checking each other back and forth. Well, what you realize as you go on in this work, and post 9/11 in particular, is that those three branches of our government all grow from the same tree of U.S. power. And there's a time when that checking doesn't work at all. There's little play in it sometimes, but essentially on national security issues, whether it's war or Guantanamo or torture, those three branches worked hand in hand to ensure that those crimes would occur and that there would be no accountability for them. That's the second lesson. Third, that these laws and these restraints are for others and not for the United States. The U.S. condemns what it calls aggression in other countries, but the U.S. is never the aggressor. It condemns Russia as an aggressor in the Ukraine, but its invasion of Iraq in 2003 is somehow not an aggression. It refers Gaddafi to the International Criminal Court, an international criminal court that the U.S. has refused to join. There are, of course, many, many such examples. I'm going to talk about two of the litigations and then close the talk on hopefully a slightly better note. Perhaps the most telling litigation is the one that I've already mentioned, which is Guantanamo, or what we call the forever detention regime. Today, 149 people remain in Guantanamo. Almost none of them were ever charged or tried. 79 have been cleared by our own government. That means they should be free to leave. Even the government said they shouldn't be there anymore. Many have been there 12 years or more, had little children who are now 15, 16, 17, 18. Think of those human beings, held incommunicado first, tortured, and now tortured in another way by being force-fed. You know, I sometimes think, when we all did the work around Chile and Pinochet, imagine if Chile, Pinochet ran such an island off the coast of Chile where he put his political prisoners, and it had been going on 12 years. Well, perhaps the government here wouldn't be screaming, but a lot of us certainly would. And of course, there was a lot of screaming about it when Obama took office, and he promised to close it in 1 year. It appears, though, that now that the Democrats are in office, that closing is far, far away. Yet Guantanamo is what I call one of our successes. In a way, it was, but it was limited. Initially, when we began the case, there was no right to test your detention, what we lawyers call the right of habeas corpus. After years of litigation, we won 2 cases in the Supreme Court that created a habeas corpus right. You could go to court and test your detention. That created the lawyers' movement, 600 lawyers, and many of them still at it. We did get a number of Guantanamo people released, not through litigation. Almost no one ever got released through litigation, but by various pressures, countries saying they wanted their citizens back, that kind of thing. But today, the right to habeas corpus, the right to test your detention, is a right in name only. No one is being released by the courts, and the courts are actually stymieing the right to be released. It's a right, as I said, in name only. We have legitimacy on the surface. Yes, we can go to court, but that's all. We have no remedy, and all 3 branches are involved. Obama says he keeps trying to close it. He has the right to close it, doesn't. Congress says you don't have the right to close it, but there's exceptions, and you can close it through those exceptions. And the court refuses to hear any other cases. 3 branches, 3 sets of clay feet. And if I look at what happened to what I considered fundamental norms of our civilization, I go back to what's coming next year. People may know. It's the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, 1215. That's what set forth the proposition that no person shall be sent to prison without a trial of his or her peers. That Magna Carta, the foundation of our Constitution, is essentially a nullity for the people at Guantanamo, for the people at Bagram. Those legal protections have been utterly eviscerated. We fight, of course, because we must. We fight because those inside do not give up hope. But we will need more than the law to end Guantanamo and what it stands for. 2 other examples I'll go into briefly. Torture. Post 9/11, this country openly and notoriously practiced torture. They used utterly spurious arguments to justify it. We discovered it slowly at Guantanamo, at Bagram. We made huge efforts to stop it and hold the tortures accountable. We tried to get those who approved it, Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, those who set the intellectual framework, you, Bybee, those who carried it out. No lawsuit got anywhere. Not here, not in Europe. We still have one pending in Spain. Am I hopeful? I'm always hopeful, but it's been many years. No criminal case. Obama gave a pass to all the torturers. Despite the absolute prohibition in the Torture Convention, despite our law's prohibition, no one has been held accountable. Yes, Obama, as far as we know, stopped torture. Not completely. There's something they call Annex M in the Army Field Manual that still allows sleep deprivation, solitary, and sensory deprivation. Those taken together can amount to torture. But without accountability, real accountability, torture becomes simply a political game. It becomes, does it work, does it not work? Should we use it next time, should we not work? It becomes essentially a political football. And so in that sense, this country will torture again when it believes it is threatened, and other countries as well. The U.S. has given a license to countries all over the world to torture. I've talked a bit about war. I'm going to say one more word about war. I've been trying to stop war since the first day I left law school, and probably since way before that. The first case, when I went to the Senate, there was a case against the Vietnam War. It was by Liz Holtzman. By 81, 76 to 81, we had what I call, some people call Carter a weak president. I loved him because he never got us into a war. It's only partly so. And it was after Vietnam. Vietnam was over in 76, so he had all these laws. War Powers Resolution, stopped the CIA from spying, all this stuff. And then, to my great shock, Reagan took office in 81. And then we began 10 years of some of the worst wars this country has engaged in, which were the Central American Wars. And those are an area I worked on tirelessly, bringing the first case called Crockett v. Reagan in 81 on behalf of Congressman Crockett, first test of the War Powers Resolution, and we came close. The judge, because it was so close to Vietnam, the War Powers Resolution had been passed, and the U.S. had put 500, quote, advisors into El Salvador. She didn't give us a victory, but she came close. I forgot her, got her name of the judge, but it was a federal judge in Washington. We went on to litigate every war after that. Nicaragua, Salvador, Grenada, Iraq won. We lost them all, and of course, the farther we got from Vietnam, the worse the decisions the worse the decisions we got from the courts. When the 2003 war came along, an illegal war, certainly from the UN point of view, not from our Congress because they voted for it. By that time, I'd given up. I wasn't going to litigate another war case. Yeah, there's some value in litigating and losing, but of course there's the AUMF, which is Authorization to Use Military Force, which those of you who are my age will remember the Gulf of Tonkin, which allowed this widespread ability of the president to go to war whenever he wanted. That's the authority the president had to go to Afghanistan. That's what he's using, arguably, to go into Libya, completely unjustified war, Yemen, Syria, Iraq again. I read a count by another friend who said we're in 7 wars now, 7 that we know about, probably a half a dozen that we don't. My conclusion from all this about war is that basically this is a country of war. We talk of legal restraints by Congress and pundits, and that's just talk. They're all put aside when war is perceived by some to be in the national interest. My last topic on this, I'll go briefly, is the one that gives a little bit of hope, which is what we call the area of surveillance, secrecy, privacy, truth tellers. That's what I began with. WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Jeremy Hammond, Edward Snowden. There we've had some success, not in a legal sense, but because of heroes coming forward. As a result, we know a lot more about what used to be what remains the pervasive surveillance state. We know a lot more about the criminality of our government. Even prior to those revelations, many of us had concluded that our privacy was over. I remember Julian Assange wrote a book called Cypherpunks, in which he pointed out that one $30 million computer, the country of Colombia, had the ability to take in every single communication coming in and out of Colombia. Every email, every phone call, every Twitter. So he said essentially it's over. His answer was, which seems very hard for even me to do, who has friends who know how to do it, is to encrypt everything. Well, that, I'm not close to that. But there's no, so on that issue, we thought that before the revelations. What we had and what we still do with a combination of surveillance and secrecy is secret government and public lives. Of course, it should be the reverse. We should have public government and private or secret lives. The litigation so far, really nothing to show for it. The legislation we all hoped for in light of Snowden, little or nothing to show for it. What is encouraging to me is that publishers and journalists and whistleblowers, truth tellers, keep making choices to risk all, and more surely will. I was at a conference when Julian was speaking on a screen out in Colorado. It was before Ed Snowden's name had come out publicly. We knew about some of his work, we didn't know it was Ed Snowden. Julian gets on the screen and he says, I can guarantee you that the person who did this is going to be under 30 years old. The NSA now has to hire tens of thousands of people for its systems. A lot of those people don't agree with the NSA. A lot of them are libertarian, they're leftist, they're progressive. They don't agree with the government. 2 hours later, comes out Edward Snowden is the leaker from the NSA. How old is he? He's 29 years old at the time. I could go on this issue after issue, human rights outrage after human rights outrage, and the failure to bring this country to task. Drones, illegally supplying weapons to Israel that are used offensively, renditions, and on and on. It's not a pretty picture. Our legal efforts to restrain this government have failed. We are, as Chomsky wrote, in very dark times. I don't know how many of you read a recent short, very dark piece by Chomsky. It's titled, Owl of Minerva's View, ISIS in Our Times. If you want to be depressed, read that piece. It gets a little better later. I know you're honoring him in a few weeks, so you can ask him. But his thesis in that piece is that our civilization may be, as he says, at its inglorious end. He's very pessimistic. He describes the consequences of the illegal 2003 Iraq War and the destruction of that area, the area that civilization 11,000 years ago arose in, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which that war led to ISIS. If anybody ever asks you, where did ISIS come from? Those are the answers. After Chomsky gives you that uplifting talk about the world coming to its inglorious end, he talks about climate change. And then it all ends. And that's the way the piece ends. So I look at the piece, and my issue, and of course, you never want to really argue with Chomsky, and I don't think I'm arguing with him. But the piece gave no hope for change, no recognition that we can fight back. Can we win? I don't know if we can win. But we can fight, we can make choices, really no choice but to be engaged. And so in the Chomsky piece, there's no mention of what was going to be the next week climate march of some 400,000 people, of the massive demonstrations around Ferguson, the growing BDS movement and the protests of the Gaza war, Occupy Wall Street, the fight on closing prisons and to end the new Jim Crow, the fight of low-wage workers in the organization CIW, where my son works in Florida, our anti-austerity movements all over the world, or MST, the Brazilian workers movement, which I mentioned, or another group I work with called NUMSA, which are the metal worker miners, 350,000 of them who are taking on the neoliberal state in South Africa, or people in struggle everywhere. I tell you this really to give you a sense that there's a lot more struggle and perhaps hope than Chomsky put into that piece. Yes, it's dark times, but it'll only get darker unless you act. And there are, as I just indicated, people acting everywhere. We do have choices. Then a couple of days ago, maybe a day ago, I pick up another Chomsky piece, maybe in response to some criticism of that earlier piece. This was a bit more encouraging. He was asked by the person questioning him if there really was no hope, if the situation was that dire. And this time, he gave us words we can live by. Quote, "We cannot know for sure if there is really no hope. What we do know, however, is that if we succumb to despair, we will help ensure that the worst will happen. And if we grasp the hopes that exist and work to make the best use of them, there might be a better world." And he ends, "Not much of a choice." And that's the way I'll end with you with Chomsky's words, "Not much of a choice."
In his talk, Michael alluded to the fact that there is this, sixth, seventh, whatever number we're up to, bombing campaign going on in Iraq, going on in Syria, maybe still going on in parts of Africa. There is, however, some opposition to this that I believe is going to happen in Congress when they get back. I'd like to call on my co-chair, Rusty Eisenberg, to at least give us an update as to where things are with regard to Congress authorizing this unending war.
You know, I really love following Michael because I seem like a wide-eyed optimist, which never happens my whole life, any other time. So thank you, Michael, for that. Okay, I'm actually going to be very brief. Many of you may have noticed, and I'm not going to give a full report on Congress, which at the moment is still trying to avoid responsibility for anything. But you will also notice that you've got this green card with a lot of print on it, and if you're like me, when you leave a meeting, you throw them out. Please don't. We're asking people to make a thank you call. Again, we don't usually do that either. But here in Brooklyn, at least, every single one of our Congress people, with the exception of Grimm, who we blame on Staten Island,
And he's going anyway.
right, every single one of them voted 2 weeks ago not to give aid or training to the Syrian rebels. And that's actually quite a significant accomplishment. Even though most of us would say it's idiotic to be giving weapons and training to the Syrian rebels, it was still a big effort on their part, and I think Brooklyn was probably the most administration on this point that of any place in the country. So that really reflects everybody here. So that's what they did 2 weeks ago before the recess. We're asking you to call them and say thank you, and even to call Kristen Gillibrand, who also voted against that decision, which is unusual for her. Good for her to hear thank you. But don't just say thank you, okay, when you call them, because the reason we're so strong about why people need to do this, really, is because either in the lame duck session, which will happen after the election, or if not that, at the beginning of the next Congress, something much larger will come before Congress, even though they're going to try like hell to avoid it. They are going to be asked to authorize the war against ISIS. That's what's going to come up. And there'll be tremendous pressure on every one of those people to go along with that. And it'll be a harder thing than just opposing giving weapons to Syrian rebels. But that is really coming. And we're not going to be able to solve that problem just by making little phone calls or saying thank you. I'm not trying to suggest that that's the end all, but it's a first step. If our members of Congress don't know that we are watching them, if they don't know that we appreciate it when they actually do something right, there's absolutely no incentive for them to resist the pressure coming from the White House. So rather than do what I normally do, which is to throw out the little green card just as I go, littering every which way, please keep that card and just make those two calls. Call Senator Gillibrand's office in Washington. They're not there, but their staff are counting you. And call those congressional offices, thank them for what they did, and remind them that as far as a constituent, that you think that fighting yet another war for the next 3 years or the next 10 years is absolutely unacceptable, and you want them to oppose it. So thanks.
All right, I promised you that you would be able to ask Michael some questions, but it's going to cost you. Brooklyn for Peace, as you know, has been around for 30 years. We do not have a treasury that allows us to coast. Meetings like this cost money. We will have people circulating in just a moment to extract your hard-earned cash. We need this, and you need to contribute to ask a question. So you have to wave your picture of Hamilton or Grant or whoever you've got in order to, now I will recognize you when you, all right. So I've made my pitch. Thank you in advance, and thank you for your attention here. Let me see who's got some questions. Well, I'll take a couple, and then we'll. No questions? Good. Oh, all right. Two. All right, go ahead. Stand up and talk loudly.
Mr. Ratner, it took you some time to take a position on something that you grew up with. How would a young man, do you have any idea how a young man like Manny, or a young person like Manny, in uniform, could make the decision he made? What forces brought him to that point? Was he hanging around with certain groups like Iraq and Peace, or was he hanging around with liberals? Or, do you have any idea how he came to that point?
Let me repeat. The question was, how did someone like Chelsea Manning come to her decision as to, to release the information, to break with the Army discipline?
I was not going to know really the answer to it. I only can tell you 2 or 3 things I heard in court. One was when he was in Iraq. It was a he at the time, but she was told to take down posters that were like First Amendment posters and get those people arrested and turn them over to the Iraqi government, and they would be tortured. And she felt that didn't make any sense. That was like crazy. What were we doing here? Why were we in this country? That was one factor. The second factor was that they were targeting people for assassination without any basis. Those were 2 factors that I think moved her on the way. She may have had some interest in that, but that was certainly 2 of the factors. She did want to go into the Army, so those were 2. The only other clue I had was when she was asked what she was reading. And the 2 books she was reading were Howard Zinn and Richard Dawkins. So whether she read those books and that put her on her way, or how important reading was, or who her friends were, I can't say. And that's the observable evidence I saw.
Question over here. Stand up, yell loud.
You spoke about large movements in Brazil of working people and grassroots people and other places, South Africa. Do you see that in the United States right now, or do you see it happening soon? And in what part of the population would you see that happening in?
David's a labor lawyer. David will give an answer. I actually, all I see is what you probably see, which is massive amount of people going out as low-wage workers and protesting, and that may, and it's organized in part by unions like the SEIU, and in that sense, that might eventually lead to something. And then I see immigrant workers like the ones my son is organizing in Florida, the Immokalee workers. Those are moving in a direction. But these are very small and much less militant than the 2 I mentioned. MST is arguably a communist left union. NUMSA, arguably as well. So those are much more militant. David, you should say something about this, because
I can only say, you've seen the fast food workers increasingly organized in this city and across the country. You've seen in New England the Pantry Pride, where you had an illegal strike. At some point, workers will figure out that collective action is what's needed, and they'll start to act collectively. whether through unions or not. But, you know, I don't see that happening at this point. On the other hand, nobody saw the 1934 general strike in, you know, San Francisco coming. So things happen very quickly, and people need to be ready to respond. So, next question.
The U.S. law seems to have run into a big wall about international law. We know that the trade agreements create private tribunals. So this is a direction backward in favor of protecting investment against regulation by government. Do you see any international movement for criminal law, for some kind of international law that holds the possibility of bringing war criminals before some kind of tribunal?
The first thing you're referring to is what we mentioned outside, I think, which is, I'm not that familiar with it, but these are private trade agreements entered with countries. So I know of one in Salvador where they have a gold mine, and maybe it's Nicaragua, and they want to pull out of the mine, Salvador, and they can be sued in these private courts. The country can be sued, and it's very costly, and it's very favorable to the companies. So this is a whole piece of activity that's going on that I'm not really familiar with. The second area I'm quite familiar with, which is international criminal law, and there's really two broad types that we work with. One is the international court. One is the the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over the territories of all the countries that have joined it. The United States has not joined it. China has not joined it. Russia has not joined it. Palestine is on the verge back and forth of joining it. Whether they do or don't, whether it has a lot to do with the pressures they're getting from the United States and other countries. If you join it, we'll cut off money to the Palestinian Authority or whatever else. It's a complex thing, but that's the International Criminal Court. It's slow moving. It's obviously going in a certain direction, partly because of who joins it, but it goes in one direction. It's indicted 36 people so far. Every single one is from Africa. We referred cases to it from Colombia, from other places. It has never done that. So the court, they would claim this is the way we get legitimacy on the backs of the, quote, easy cases, or the non-threatening, whatever you want to call them, more capitalist countries. But International Criminal Court is not the place where we're going to be getting a lot of justice. Then there's International Criminal Court in almost every court in the world. And it's called universal jurisdiction. And it means that, and it was one of the cases, the case that I mentioned that David worked on. The language at the end of the case David worked on, which said, a torturer is like a pirate of old. And they used the term in Latin, hostis humanus generis, an enemy of all humankind, and can be brought to justice anywhere in the world. And that's the way someone who's tortured is looked at now under the Torture Convention and in the courts. So technically, if a torturer comes into the United States has to either begin an investigation and prosecute that person if they find enough, or transfer him to a country where he'll be prosecuted. So there is that. I just want to say we've had a spectacular failure in getting anything done in that area on Rumsfeld, Cheney, Bush, Israel, you name it.
I mean, let me just add, we've had a spectacular failure even of taking relatively minor torturers who happen to show up, you know, from Haiti and other places that are not, you know, considered vital national security. So we'll take here and then here. Stand up and talk loudly.
When you mentioned failure, I mean, leaders who were looked at as human rights violators, such as Narendra Modi, are now celebrated by our government. So it doesn't seem to me that there is any accountability at all, you know, on a human rights level in terms of national policy. We simply choose leaders who suit our ends. what do you have to say about that?
Modi is one of the great outrages. He's the new Prime Minister of India, as I'm sure you know. He's just had 5 days of essentially state celebration. In the United States, he was what I call the murderer of Gujarat, where some 2,000 Muslims were killed either directly at his orders or he stood by and let the military do it. And he should be in the dock. There's not an issue about it. And when he was first going to come here, we had prepared a case. It was 2000, I don't remember how many years ago. May have been even, what year was Gujarat massacre?
2002.
That's what it was. Okay. Shortly after that, he was going to make a trip here. We prepared a case on behalf of people from Gujarat, and he eventually got barred from the United States as a human rights violator. Not because he killed the Muslims, but because he killed a bunch of Christians while he was at it. But he did get barred. And now we see he's won the election in India, and we don't have to go into Indian politics, and about where that middle class, which compromises the 200 million people who probably put him into office, and perhaps the corruption of the other parties, somehow got Modi elected. And it's a complete, utter outrage. There was a case filed here, I saw by somebody. Whether that'll mean anything, it probably won't, because now that he's a head of state, he's much harder to sue.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I look around, I see venerable elders here, but what's missing is an active participation of younger people, there's a certain, I'm sorry, but homogeneity to the group, which is a problem. I mean, I don't see...
Help us.
Well, yeah, the problem is when, for example, I know, okay, a question is, this is a question to the group, okay? Why, what is this group doing to actually bring the message to organizers around Ferguson, or organizers from Occupy Wall Street, or organizers, there has to be some kind of cross-fertilization, otherwise we're dead in the water.
Well, I think that's a great idea. I hope you'll talk with us at the reception immediately following this. Let me get a couple other questions. Ted?
I'm not going to change the subject a little bit, but I'm not sure this is any cause for optimism. What's going on in the United States domestically with the tax on the Voting Rights Act, the tax on the Citizen United, and new Jim Crow, all the Supreme Court decisions. Do you see any optimism, how we can fight back? Is there legal ways of fighting back? All these things that have occurred and destroyed, in a sense, a lot of the progress that we've made over the 50 years.
I think the new Jim Crow and Michelle Alexander's book and also the situation has made a big difference. And if you were to ask me what movements there were in the United States, I think there's a real movement around the prison system and changing the drug laws, and I think that's going to be a real growing movement. That coupled with perhaps an immigration movement, a low-wage workers movement, and what's happening in Ferguson, police violence, and there is, maybe referring to this, it gets worse every time we go to the court. Perhaps if the court changes, it'll reverse that decision. But money is very important to the people who run this country. And people used to say we don't really have one person, one vote, because a person who can pay a lot of money controls 10 votes, 100 votes, 1,000 votes, or 1,000,000 votes. That system, including the system in Congress because of that, I think is very difficult to change from a legal point of view. I think if people start demanding it, perhaps we can do that on a grassroots level. But it's almost fruitless. Even Obama didn't stay on the legal limits of fundraising because his opponent did. So you already had the system shot to hell. They already have the belief, I remember when I first saw the sign in the window, Mike Bloomberg for mayor, what was it, 13 years ago? My daughter's 10 years old at the time. And she says, Daddy, who's that? And I say to her, I don't know, I've never heard of him. He doesn't have any chance. And $75 million later, he became our mayor.
Three times.
What? 3 times. Right, so the point of that is that the exemption now in the court for very rich people to buy elections is wide open and not going anywhere. And to their, I'm not sure what the position of the ACLU is right now on this anymore, but they were ones who equated for a long time money and free speech. I don't.
About the tax on the voting rights.
Oh,
Do we have anybody?
well, that they're litigating, that there's people litigating, the individual attacks state by state are being heavily litigated every time they go into effect. Having to do with how many days you can vote, what the hours for closing, all identity cards, and they're having mixed results.
All right, let's go over this way. Naomi, and then
I think a lot of people know about the mass incarceration phenomenon, but I don't think that many people know about the special gulag that exists in federal prisons in this country, all over the country, as a result of the Patriot Act and similar types of legislation that are directly tied to the surveillance and entrapment of young Muslims in the United States. Where solitary confinement is used and all kinds of special regulations to isolate and put these prisoners at a disadvantage. That's been particularly intractable. I mean, I've been working around some of these cases for several years, and I'm wondering what you think we can do, what kind of approach we can make to that issue that'll help, first of all, publicize it, and secondly, attack it.
Now they're gonna put me behind one of those green screens, and then they're all gonna be the lion and whatever they come to the Wizard of Oz, and then you're gonna ask me the question. And because I don't do the litigation at my office, but we do that litigation. It's called communications management units. It's part of it, and we have clients who are in the communications management unit. They're practically underground. You can't touch your loved ones. You get one call every 6 months. You're buying plastic, and they're horrible, and they originally were set up for Muslims. There's no question about it. But because that looked too horrible when we started raising the issue, they threw in a few animal rights, quote, terrorists, and a few others to make it look like this was a different thing. But those are being heavily litigated now. But for one question we always had, and I'll leave it at that because you obviously need to get out the word much more about it. Their litigation can probably push with some grassroots work and do better. I think both the ACLU and the Center are litigating CMUs. When we first did the Guantanamo cases, and Guantanamo was unique for a certain period of time, because there was real torture going on. But the question we always had was whether we should attach it into what was happening in U.S. prisons as well, and whether that would make a stronger movement to try and say, this is Guantanamo, but this is also happening in U.S. prisons. I don't have the answer. We didn't do it. I don't know how conscious it was that we didn't do it, but we didn't do it. In retrospect, I think it would have been better to not say that this at Guantanamo, except for the fact they've never been charged and never tried, but their conditions and their forever detention, this is actually an extension of the U.S. prison system. And maybe that would have been a way of looking at it a little differently. But I agree, it's a very, if you get stuck in an elevator for an hour, I go completely nuts. I'm serious. So think about these places people are in, certainly 23 hours a day. Oftentimes they don't get their hour of exercise.
okay, over here.
In around 2008, I believe the government had NSA turn over their raw, unfiltered data to Israel. I don't think it went through any FISA court or any other means, except, by the way, for official congressional and administration messages. My question is, since they have all this data that should be private, shouldn't there be an existing law on the books that's supposed to protect this, just as the FISA courts protect us at home, since they have everything that NSA collects?
What you're referring to, I don't know how many people know about it. It was a terrible thing that happened, and it came out. I think it was a Glenn Greenwald article in The Intercept, I forgot who wrote it, about NSA turning over a lot of the raw data to Israel on people who are not criminal at all, but who might be gay or in an affair or whatever, both Palestinians and Israelis. And then Israel had the ability to be able to go after those people, blackmail, do whatever else to them. It's a scandal that we're just beginning to find out about, really. And someone suggested to me it might be a perfect kind of lawsuit in terms of, representing some of those people if we could figure out how to do it. Should there be a law? Of course there should be. Have we gotten any restrictions through Congress on any of this stuff with the NSA yet? We came close on one, but very, very little. All of the hype we had about it, all of Obama's speeches, it's still all going on. And it's not just the NSA. I was at a conference the other day on cybersecurity by all the big guys, and the general counsel for Verizon was there, and he is so conservative and so right-wing. What he said to us, he said, whenever the people from Silicon Valley, all the Google types and all those, want to do something a little different or protect our information, he just says, I was at 9/11, and I remind them that we are responsible for the security of the United States. So it's not just the NSA. It's these telephone providers, Verizon in particular. If you remember Snowden's first revelation, the first order that he brought out of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was the one that authorized Verizon to take all the metadata on our telephones.
Yeah,
So,
AT&T was doing it before Verizon.
what?
AT&T was doing it before Verizon.
No, they all.
AT&T had a special room where
Yes,
they routed everybody's information.
Yeah, no, they're
and
all.
I knew about that was 2008.
And they lost the litigation, unfortunately. There was the guy who found it. So I'm just saying, restraining the NSA is not an easy task right now. Not an easy task.
Just one quick. Is that because there's no one that has any standing to sue because we don't know what Israel is doing with the information?
Well,
We're personally.
that's how we've lost the cases so far. The next case we may not lose because we're getting better and better information on who it's targeted for. But the ACLU argued a case that came close. They didn't actually have someone saying, we're doing it to Glenn Greenwald, we're doing it to Michael Ratner, we're doing it to Guantanamo attorneys. But they had the criteria meant that they were. The Supreme Court 5-4 said there's no one who can actually prove it was done to them, what you're referring to as standing. But I think we're going to get there.
Next.
Yeah, hi, Michael. I'd like to see CCR expand its mission to include crimes against the earth and open up a whole new avenue, as they do in Bolivia now, right?
I'm going to say Bolivia has a law, what's it called?
Yeah, again,
Special law.
right.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of strategic reasons for that, as well as moral reasons, that I think that opens up an area that could be advantageous to us all. And I was thinking that 3 months ago, Fidel met with Putin. Fidel has dropped out of all the news, right? But he met with Putin, and I was looking at what they talked about. They didn't actually, I couldn't find the actual content, but I saw the outline, and it was Fidel going on as he does for hours, against genetic engineering. And following that meeting, as I understand it, Putin banned all genetic engineering in Russia. Now I have to check that, I need to check that, but that's how I understand it right now, right? So on the one hand, Putin, we're sorry that anybody has that power to just, on the other hand, fuck them, you know? So I think there's a point to this.
It's called the law of Mother Earth. It's called the law of Mother Earth, and I'm familiar with it. Because one of my kids was in Bolivia, and they love this law. And it's a great law, because it encompasses all the communities and the earth itself when you're doing anything.
Right.
And so I think
And it opens up a whole new area that we can take advantage of also.
It's like giving trees
It
rights.
seems even though we can't really affect our own government for years now, it seems that our actions, including Brooklyn for Peace, affect what other people around the world take up that affect their government, that then affect the U.S. government in a roundabout way, in an indirect way, such as on genetic engineering in Europe, or in Africa, where they prevented genetic engineering in Zambia. So there's hope in this roundabout way, but we need to pull it together.
This was always my great hope. So you've struck, I think the law of the Mother Earth I love. We should go back and look at it again. But even my work, I remember in the 80s in Central America, this may have been naive, there were all those revolutions, right? Nicaragua, so my hope was struggle on the periphery. That by doing that, in the peripheral colonies of the United States, it would shift and change something here. So all related. I think those are great. Right there and then there.
So you are going to do that at CCR, right?
Law of the Mother Earth, I think we will. I like it.
Good.
Remember, I made 10 suggestions for what I would do if I were Attorney General. I did it in the Independent. And the 10th one was adopting the law of the Mother Earth. So.
I need a clarification. I listened to people representing Hamas, and I haven't heard that we want to destroy Israel. And every time I read something from some Zionist or something, whatever, it's always, we don't like Hamas, they want to destroy Israel. It's in their charter or something like that. Can you clarify it? However, right or wrong.
I can just tell you, Noam Chomsky gave a long piece on Democracy Now! About 3 weeks ago. And he talked about the piece, say, it might be worth, because I'm just going to parrot it, basically. He talked about the Hamas charter, and he said, look, the Hamas charter, whatever it says in the charter, was put together by a few people long years ago that doesn't really represent Hamas, and they were willing to go into a 50-year truce with Israel. So that's the way he talked about that. Then he talked about the Likud charter. That was more interesting. Likud is Netanyahu's party. The Likud charter has in it, and this is more serious according to Chomsky, because Likud runs the government and can actually carry out what's in their charter. Likud's charter says there shall never be a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. That's right. So what we get here, and it's propaganda, we always hear about the Hamas charter without certainly the fact that they were going to enter a 50-year truce. We never hear Netanyahu's Likud charter, which says essentially no Palestinian state, no West Bank at all. So I can give you that answer to that particular question.
That's enough.
Okay.
Good.
Ed?
So it's my
Stand up and talk loud.
I'm not talking loud enough?
He's loud, he's very loud.
It's my understanding that without Assad endorsing the United States intervention in Syria, that it's a violation of international law for the United States to do what it's doing in Syria. And my sense or understanding is that that's caused some problems for many European countries who are being asked to join us. So I'm just curious, is it a violation? Is it causing some problems? And what might you have speculate on what that might all mean?
Certainly, if Syria has not given authority to the United States to bomb in its country, it's a violation of international law. The UN Charter is very clear that the territorial boundaries of a country are sacrosanct and you can't go bomb inside a country. The U.S. does it frequently with drones and everything else. Perhaps parts of Europe do it occasionally. Europe, I think probably I haven't read what Europe said about that, but assuming Europe says we're nervous about the fact that there's no authority and we don't want to join the United States when they're crossing a border and creating aggression, essentially. Europe has generally, but I want to be careful about this, been more willing to adhere to those laws than the United States. And I would say that's for two reasons. One is they need the legal protections more because they don't have the armies that the United States has. And secondly, perhaps after 400 years of war, they prefer not to get into big wars again. And they believe in the rule of law somewhat more than the biggest bully on the block. But the point is, what you're saying sounds accurate to me. If Assad didn't give that permission, you might be reluctant to join them without that permission. Now, what you never know what's really been said. That's all I'll say. Assad may say publicly, I haven't given permission, but he may be very happy to have the U.S. coming in there and wiping out ISIS. And he may be in some way telling them I am, but I don't know.
All right, we'll take two last questions and then we'll go downstairs and talk informally.
I'd like to pick up on the point that Mitch was making, and also this young woman who, when she was talking about the gray hair in the room. There's this young woman, Kelsey Juliana, that I saw on Bill Moyer's show, and she's got this lawsuit against the state of Oregon. It's called Our Children's Trust, and it's kind of like the Cochabamba Mother Earth lawsuit. Do you know anything about that?
No,
at
I
all?
don't.
Because it seems to me that this is a very important direction for the youth to be going in who are now mobilized around climate change and may not still grasp the issue of imperialism. But this is kind of the ultimate imperialism is, you know, taking over the earth. Do you see any possibility of something like that having a chance? It's basically a lawsuit to protect the commons for the future.
You know, I'm sorry I'm not familiar with the lawsuit. There's certainly a lot of work been going on about the commons and trying to regain the commons and movements. You know, in terms of, you know, I think the climate march was an illustration about the number of young people who are now potentially there to move people and to move this country in a different direction. And I think that's where the energy is. And if I looked at a lawsuit like that, what I would want it to be was part of a strategy of a strong grassroots movement of people. And then I would think it would represent a chance. A lawsuit sitting there just because, I don't know the circumstances.
She's doing
Maybe
a
it
walk
does.
across the country.
Yeah, I actually heard something about that part of it. But I'm just saying, if a movement is built up behind it, and you get a judge, and there's chances of those things. But I guess can't stress the importance of, as we all know, of grassroots movements that make change. I mean, I'll just, you know, I came to my office only because I wanted to do cases that I agreed with representing grassroots movements. It started with the Southern Civil Rights Movement, anti-war movement, went on from there. When we took the Guantanamo cases, that was almost the first case that I'd ever taken in which there was not a grassroots movement, in which I actually had no movement at all. It was a pure legal case. I just felt it was so harsh what was going on that my office had a debate about it and had to take it. So I generally go very strongly with wanting to go with grassroots. And my son, who, as I said, works at Immokalee Workers, as far as he's concerned, you know, lawyers can go north and do whatever they want. So,
We'll take one last question and then go downstairs.
One question. How do you deal with people in this country when they see the beheading of journalists by ISIS? Because I know in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and these other countries that behead people and they treat women like crap in these countries. And how do you answer them, and how do you deal with that question?
those are hard. You know, the beheading, you know, none of us, maybe there's some people who could watch the video. I certainly couldn't watch it. And so it's a horrible, graphic description that inflames people. And I think what you have, I mean, no one is saying that's good or the right thing to do, so that's obvious. What you also have to do is put things in a context of how, why is that coming about? How many children were killed in Gaza during the 2 months before, and how one thing inflames you, but the other thing should inflame you as well. And so we should look at those in those ways. It's hard to do because that is such, those images are very graphic and very difficult, and you don't want to back away from saying that's horrible, because that's horrible.
Very good.
Thank you, Michael. I think you'll agree he is a genuine Pathmaker to Peace. Come join us downstairs, and let's chat some more. Thank you.